Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Tim Moen Show. Glad you joined us. I've got a special one for you again today. Now, I'm going to recommend something. I want you to go to my Substack and sign up to drop in your email. There's no charge at all. But when I have special episodes like the one we're about to have, I blast it out on Substack and make sure that people that are interested in the content I cover and the issues I cover, make sure they get notified ASAP. And this one's a very important one I have today. You know, as well as I do, that our freedoms have been under erosion. Another related to that fact, I would ask you also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please also subscribe on Rumble. The links are all below to my Substack, to my Rumble. I broadcast on YouTube because that's a wide audience and it seems like a platform that most people use. But I'm cognizant of the fact that my time here is limited. We touch on subjects that are taboo sometimes. And it's just a matter of time, I suspect, before YouTube boots me. And so I'm trying to grow my Rumble audience, my Substack audience. So please, if you haven't, subscribe to those two channels as well, so that make sure you get this important information. Now, as a firefighter, it is a bad day for my community when I'm busy. When there's a lot of work for a firefighter, that's no good. And just like my next guest, when there's a lot of work for my next guest, it's not a good day for Canadians. My guest today is John Carpay, who's a constitutional lawyer, and he's the president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. You'll remember him from the COVID bureaucracy days when he was leading the fight against constitutional infringements left, right, and center by our governments, both provincially and federally, with regards to COVID mandates. And now he's here to warn us of the latest threat to our liberty, the Online Harms Act. And I was looking for someone to talk to, and this is the perfect guy. John, welcome to the Tim Moen Show.
Hey, glad to be with you, Tim. Glad to be with your viewers and listeners.
All right. So the Online Harms Act, who could be against online harms, John? I mean, it's like the Patriot Act, right? I mean, you're a patriot, right? Why wouldn't you support this?
Well, especially when it's to protect children. I mean, you couldn't possibly be against a law that's going to protect children from online harms.
Well,
they know what they're doing when they're selling it. And believe you me, they need good salesmanship, because this is the most aggressive assault on free expression in modern Canadian history. It's going to empower the federal, if it passes in its current form, and it need not. It's really up to Canadians to roll up their sleeves and be engaged in the democratic process. But if it passes in current form, you're going to have the federal cabinet acquire regulatory powers to create censorship rules for social media services that will be enforced against the operators of social media services by a new Digital Safety Commission. Aren't they clever? Eh?
Safety. Well, I mean, we want a safe place, right?
We have to remember, in the French Revolution, it was the Committee for Public Safety that chopped off the heads of thousands of people. That was all, public safety. We got to chop off heads to keep everybody safe. So it's the same rhetoric. Governments never violate your rights and freedoms without coming up with a nice sounding pretext.
Right. Well, I read your primer there on the act, and I guess you've got a petition going. And folks, I'm going to put a link to that petition in the show notes. Please make sure you go down there and sign it. It reminds me, John, of what Jordan Peterson went through with his college a little bit. You know, he had some anonymous people, weren't even his patients, talk about the harm that they suffered from some of his tweets about people that weren't even them. And they lodged a complaint, and he went to essentially a kangaroo court, a body of people at his college, and had to argue to keep his license there. And of course, they sentenced him to re-education. And of course, he didn't submit to that. So I guess he's now barred from ever practicing in Ontario as a clinical psychologist again, which is, to I imagine, all of his patients' detriment. But am I wrong in saying that this is now being taken out of the kind of, I guess, pseudo regulatory professional framework, and it's now going to apply to everyone in Canada, regardless of whether you're a professional or not. Just every citizen is now going to have a duty to think properly, to not engage in wrong think. Am I wrong about that?
Well, the Canadian Human Rights Commission is going to get back the powers that were taken away from it 10 years ago by the Harper government when they repealed Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, so these new powers that the Human Rights Commission...
Oh, wait a second. So I was under the impression that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal was disbanded, that all that was left were provincial human rights. Was I wrong about that, or?
The only thing that Harper did, and it was a good thing, was he removed that section of the Canadian Human Rights Act that allowed people to file complaints against somebody else's speech. And that's where you had situations like Ezra Levant and Mark Stein over so-called Islamophobic comments. And then there's this activist lawyer in Ottawa by the name of Richard Warman, would go online and pose as a Nazi and then bait people into making, anti-Semitic or racist statements, what have you. And then he filed complaint against those people. And the conviction rate was close to 100%. And so Harper got rid of that. But the rest of the body, like if it's, let's say you're working for, Air Canada or WestJet, federally regulated industry, and you can file a discrimination complaint that you were discriminated against on the basis of religion or color or sexual orientation, whatever. So the Federal Human Rights Act is still there. What Harper took out was this nasty provision, Section 13, that was had a serious chilling effect on free speech all across Canada.
Right. Okay, I was under the impression that he took the teeth out of them, but they're still there lurking, and now it looks like Trudeau wants to put some dentures with maybe some fangs in him back into the human rights. So talk a little bit, just as a sidetrack, why is going to a human rights tribunal bad? Like what is the problem with human rights tribunals per se?
Well, let me focus on the speech side of the equation first and foremost, because the rest of it, I mean, it's a huge topic and it's a very important one.
Okay.
I mean, the human rights legislation, whether federal or provincial, interferes with the freedom of association that we normally would enjoy. But putting aside the free speech thing, right? You've got human rights legislation would say that, Walmart or Alberta Health Services or, any employer, they cannot discriminate on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and some other grounds. And so that's, libertarians would say, no, it's an unjustified violation of freedom of association.
Yeah.
And then other people would say, well, it's not too bad. We don't want to live in a country where you've got signs on the door that say, blacks need not apply, or Jews need not apply, or women need not apply, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll focus in just on the free speech provisions, because you can have human rights legislation that does not infringe on your right to speak your political, religious, philosophical convictions. So what's wrong with the human rights speech provisions is that, it's a long list. For one, it subjects you to the threat of having a complaint filed against you if you say something that's deemed to be hateful by a bureaucrat working for the Canadian Human Rights Commission. These people are mostly woke and progressive, and the type of speech that will probably run afoul of the new rules will be conservative speech, libertarian speech, socially conservative speech, politically incorrect speech on immigration, politically incorrect speech on Aboriginal issues, Aboriginal policy, etc. That'll probably be the first, most of the complaints will be filed in those areas.
Right.
What the supporters of this censorship don't realize, they're very short-sighted. 20 years from now, we might have a very different government in office. Maybe it's a government that doesn't really like LGBTQ speech, or it doesn't like climate alarmism. or
Right.
and the very same powers of the state. Governments are not always going to be the same. There's going to be politicians of a different stripe. And some of the supporters of this censorship are going to find themselves silenced at some point when they want to say something. And now they've got a government with a different philosophy that's going to say, oh, well, we're going to shut you down because we think that what you're saying is hateful.
Yeah. Well, yes. And it reminds me, John, of what I've seen for quite a while in the corporate world, which is, policies in the corporate world around harassment or bullying or something like that often have nothing to do with context or intent, but everything to do with how the accuser feels, their perception of what you did. So if I work hard to be offended by something you say, well, I win. Because it doesn't, the facts don't matter. What your intent was doesn't matter. What you actually said doesn't matter, but how I perceived it, how I took it, how I felt about it, that's what matters. And if I felt bad because after you said something, well, that's your fault, John, and therefore you should be punished. And we see HR departments constantly punishing people for hurting feelings, so to speak. But now it looks like that's codified into law, where if I'm the accuser, I just have to tell people that I felt offended and I felt like this person hates me, and they have that. So am I getting it wrong here? Or?
It is pretty much like that. And I mean, hate, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
You take something, you've probably heard the slogan, I'm sure many people, since October 7th, when the Hamas went into Israel and massacred over 1,000 civilians. And then some weeks later, Israel launched a military attack into Gaza to try to destroy Hamas. Now, there's Palestinian rallies at which you'll hear the slogan, quote, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," end of quote.
Right.
Now, some people say that's hateful because it's advocating for genocide, the killing of Jews, and that all Jews living in Israel should all be murdered. Other people would say, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means that, Palestinians should be able to roam freely wherever they want in that area. And, it shouldn't be the state of Israel. It should be maybe the state of Palestine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the Jews are going to get killed. And so, you've got countries, Germany, Czech Republic, and Estonia have actually said that it's a criminal speech to say that slogan, quote, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," end quote. And there was a man in Calgary a few weeks ago, or maybe it was November, December, recently, got arrested for chanting this slogan. They stayed the charges and didn't go through with prosecution. But here's the problem with hate. Hate is an emotion. Hate, if it's directed against injustice, racism, lies, it could even be a positive thing, depending on what it's directed towards, right?
Right.
We should hate injustice. We should hate tyranny. We should hate lies. But in any event, whether I'm saying something hateful or not, or whether you're saying something hateful, it's very subjective. And so that's dangerous because you get these complaints filed. Now, worst case scenario, you're going to be ordered to pay $20,000 to the person whose feelings were hurt by what you said. And on top of that, you could also be ordered to pay up to $50,000 to the federal government. Grand total of $70,000 maximum penalty. And that doesn't include any of the legal bills that you may have incurred along the way. Apart from money, it's incredibly stressful. You get a letter in the mail from the Canadian Human Rights Commission saying a complaint has been filed against you. By the way, anonymous complaints are allowed under the Online Harms Act. So that's another treacherous thing. So you don't have the right to face your accuser, see your accuser, question your accuser. These are basic rights that have been with us for centuries, that are embedded in our common law tradition, that you have the right to face your accuser and question your accuser, or have your lawyer ask questions of your accuser. And that can be taken away here because in its discretion, the Human Rights Commission can choose to anonymize complaints. So you could have a guy in Vancouver file a complaint against a lady in Halifax over having made a derogatory comment about a mosque in Toronto. And even if the members of that mosque in Toronto are not upset or offended, the guy in Vancouver can still anonymously files complaint against the
Sure.
lady in Halifax, and she'll not necessarily know who filed the complaint. So
Right.
that's
Well,
bad.
this is a huge cudgel to be used for those, kind of woke activists that are constantly outrage farming and trying to cancel people. You've just handed them unlimited ammo, basically, to destroy lives. Is this going to be criminalized? Is it in the criminal code at all, or is it? Is it? I mean, how do we classify this act?
Well, that's an excellent question. One of the things about the Online Harms Act is that it ignores the fact that just about everything in this act is already criminal. For example, posting revenge porn online is criminal. Posting an intimate image of somebody without their consent is a criminal code offense. Advocating for genocide, right, like the total killing of a people group, is already criminal. The willful promotion of hatred, Criminal Code Section 319, is already criminal to willfully promote hatred against a group based on an identifiable characteristic. And there's a list of them, including the race, ancestry, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, religion, and so on. So that's already criminal. Advocating for violence is criminal. Advocating or planning terrorism is criminal. Advocating for the violent overthrow of the government, to advocate for that, is already criminal. It's already criminal to advocate, to counsel somebody to commit a criminal offense. So if I said to you, Tim, you should light a building on fire, which of course you'd be the last person to do that. But
Job security.
Maybe you've got a sinister motive, right? But if I said that to you seriously and I wasn't joking, that would be criminal code offense to urge somebody to set a building on fire. So all of these are already criminal code offenses, and that does have a chilling effect on free speech up to a point. But with criminal code, if you're charged criminally, you can raise truth as a defense against criminal charges. So, for example, if you said that there was a particular ethnic group in Canada that had higher rates of alcoholism, family violence, unemployment, lower rates of school attendance, higher rates of pregnancies out of wedlock, you could, under the criminal code, first of all, it's not likely you would be accused of hate speech. But if you were, you could raise the defense of truth, and you could say, well, look, this is actually true about this ethnic group. They really do have higher rates of alcoholism, this, that, and the other thing. Under the human rights legislation, truth is not a defense. So if somebody said, well, you said something hateful about this group because of what you said, well, you can't defend yourself by saying that what you said was true. You just have to hope to God that the bureaucrats that are prosecuting you are going to agree with you that somehow what you said was not hateful. And again, this is entirely subjective. You can't argue against somebody thinking it's hateful or feeling that it's hateful or not hateful.
Right. And this is, again, prosecuted at a human rights tribunal, or is there any? So
if the Online Harms Act gets passed unchanged, right? If the Liberals and NDP together use their majority and ram it through without changes, which they conceivably could do, well, then the Human Rights Commission is going to have these new powers. So we're going to still have the criminal code prohibition against willful promotion of hate speech. That'll still be there. But in addition to that, there's going to be the Canadian Human Rights Commission can prosecute you over non-criminal hate speech. And so there the net is far wider, far broader. We don't see very many criminal prosecutions over willful promotion of hatred. We're going to see a lot of prosecutions over something hateful in the eyes of some woke progressive bureaucrats.
Wow. And they are offended by literally everything. So, I mean, there's no end to this. What problem is the government claiming they're solving? We have all this, we already have criminal legislation that covers everything you and I would care about, the content that threatens or intimidates a child, all the stuff you talked about. What problem are they claiming they're solving here with this act?
Well, there's a few of them. One of them, they want to protect children from online harms, and that could, we've had some tragic cases of where you have situations where adults are counseling children to damage themselves or to cut themselves or something like that. You've got all the so-called phobias, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, which this government hates, and so the criminal code is quite narrow, and there are defenses available, and you have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt, which means that a prosecutor, generally speaking, and we do have some corruption amongst prosecutors that will prosecute for political reasons or refrain to prosecute what they ought to prosecute, also for political reasons. But by and large, prosecutors will abide by a rule that says you don't prosecute somebody criminally unless you have a reasonable likelihood of conviction. So a crown prosecutor is going to look at a hate crime or at a criminal code violation for hate speech, and in a lot of cases they're going to go, ooh, gee, we don't think we have reasonable grounds of getting a conviction, because they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person said something that was hateful and that they intended to promote hatred. That's pretty hard to prove. Right. So the federal government is not happy with the amount of homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia.
They want to legislate away any meanness.
Okay? Yeah. So this human rights. So what are they trying? The problems they're trying to solve is bullying of children online. Well, there's another criminal code offense for you: to threaten somebody, right? If I said, you've got to give me $1 million, or you got to have me on your show every week for the next 10 weeks for a full hour, otherwise I'm going to destroy your property or burn your house down or whatever, right? Uttering threats is a criminal code offense. Intimidation, which I haven't looked at the definition recently, but there's so these children are already protected by, well, they're not. Here's the other thing. The government seems to be oblivious to the fact that parents have a responsibility to see to it that their kids are not, 16 hours a day unsupervised internet.
Right.
I mean, this is outrageous. Like good parents will control and supervise and monitor and yes, restrict the amount of time that their kids are spending online, who they're interacting with. Is your daughter having a texting with a stranger who's an adult? I mean, there's parents have a responsibility, and the Justice Minister, Arif Virani, if I'm saying it right, he said, my kids, they play with Lego, and Lego has safety. There are regulations to govern Lego to make sure it's safe. And the same way, we need the biggest toy in everybody's house is the internet. So we need the government to regulate the internet. And I thought, wow. So you just let your kids just spend whatever amounts of time and talk to whoever they want to talk to and get into any kind of, chat room, social media, whatever. So, but this seems to be the mindset, is that parents cannot be trusted to parent their kids properly and restrict access when appropriate. And so now the government's going to step in and save the children and try to be this parent.
Well, yeah. And the type of parent that would, let their child be unsupervised and not engage with them on a regular basis is exactly this type of parent we see on TV when tragedy strikes, blaming society, blaming government, blaming everyone else but themselves for the tragedy that has befallen their child.
Like if your kid is getting, they're depressed and becoming suicidal because of bullying, like why are you letting your kid keep on spending that time online? Like, turn off the computer and build some real relationships with real people in real life, where you really meet together in the same space at the same time, which, by the way, is a basic human need. We need that as much as we need water. It's wonderful to have telephones and Zoom chats and everything. Nothing wrong with that. But like, we need the face-to-face, two people, physical bodies in the same room. That's a basic human need that we have. We need it as much as water. And so it's very sad how parents allow their kids to drift into a zone where the kid is completely depressed or perhaps terrorized or bullied or suicidal because they're spending so much time online.
Yes, and the more we outsource our personal responsibility to the government, the more we have the government gladly taking it on. It's no coincidence that that strong families are not conducive to big government. And if you are a bureaucrat, a politician who makes a living off big government, of course, you see no issues with government replacing the role of the parent, and particularly the father, right? We're seeing an epidemic of fatherlessness, and just protection that should be occurring in the home, where the father is protecting the child from bad things and from actual harms. That's gone, and now we're outsourcing it to the state. It's a shame, and it seems like it's all part of the same kind of vector that we're going on. I want to talk a little bit about this fine that you talked about. The order to pay the federal government $50,000 plus $20,000 to a victim. What happens if you don't pay that fine, John?
Ultimately, you could land up in jail, because the order of the Human Rights Tribunal. So the commission's the prosecutor, the tribunal is like the court, the decision maker, right, on whether you're guilty or innocent. But again, in the past, the tribunal was almost always ruling in favor of the commission, so there was a very high conviction rate. But the order of the tribunal can be registered as a federal court order. So if you refuse to pay the $50,000, that's the maximum, by the way. You could be ordered to pay less. If you refuse, then you could be found to be in contempt of court, and contempt of court will land you in jail, and you will stay in jail until you purge your contempt.
Oh, I see. So until you serve your sentence. And if just humor me here for a second, if I refuse to go to jail and I defend myself from those people that are trying to put me in jail, what's likely to happen to me?
I mean, ultimately, we like to think that in Canada we're kind and gentle, caring and sharing, and we're not into firearms. The truth of the matter is, ultimately, if push comes to shove, if you continue to resist government, at the end of the day, ultimately, you're going to have police officers or soldiers at your house to enforce the law. You take a taxation case, for example, right? Initially, if you had a dispute with the government over taxes, initially they would try to garnish your wages. They might try to seize your bank account. They might try this, that, and the other thing. Ultimately, they might foreclose on your property. But then ultimately, at the end of the road, if push comes to shove, if you're refusing to leave your house, and they will bring in the police or the soldiers with guns at the end of the day, even though we don't see that very often. So that's the ultimate form of state coercion. And it is available for the government's use in Canada, as it is in every other country.
Right. So, audience, these aren't suggestions. These are mandatory, backed by gun laws that dictate your thought, your speech. In your primer, you talk about a couple other things I want to touch on. One is that you don't even need to identify a victim to bring in a complaint, and the other one is something about it struck me almost like something out of Minority Report, a pre-crime. Yes. You think so? Can you talk a little bit about those two aspects?
Yeah. So the Online Harms Act has a bunch of different provisions in it to amend other pieces of legislation. And so one of the provisions is to add a section to the criminal code that is not there currently, that if you fear that your next door neighbor is going to commit a speech crime and advocate for and willfully promote hatred or advocate for genocide, if you believe that your next door neighbor is going to commit a speech crime, which I don't know how you would know that, but I guess somehow. So you can go to provincial court and file a complaint, and that person will be brought before provincial court. And if the judge thinks that there are reasonable grounds that the accused person is going to commit a speech crime, advocate for willful promotion of hatred, advocacy for genocide, the judge can issue a court order that person needs to wear an ankle bracelet,
right,
be under house arrest, adhere to a curfew, refrain from seeing certain individuals, refrain from going certain places, possibly be ordered to abstain from alcohol and drugs, and if so, can be ordered to provide blood or urine samples to prove that they're not taking alcohol and drugs, and could have to forfeit, give up their legally owned, legally acquired firearms, turn those over to the government. All of those things could be ordered against an individual because she might commit a speech crime.
Right. So one of my audience members might misgender someone, and maybe they have a history of misgendering people, and you could convince a judge that it's likely to happen again in the future against someone. If the judge considers that hateful,
and there's a reasonable likelihood that it might happen again.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people out there that refuse to use woke pronouns, right? They will stick with the biological sex, and that's that. Well, that would surely be considered hateful. I mean, there's no other reason other than hate to do that from the government's perspective and from society writ large's perspective. It seems that would be a pre-crime.
And there's the chilling effect, because
right.
I would venture a guess that a fair-minded judge would not likely place somebody under house arrest over misgendering, because I think a reasonable judge would say, well, you might to misgender somebody is probably running afoul of the human rights legislation, which is non-criminal, but again, up to $50,000 fine payable to the government, $20,000 payable to the victim whose feelings were hurt, and tens of thousands in legal bills. And then there's non-monetary, there's the anguish and the stress of getting prosecuted. You got this thing hanging over you like a dark cloud for years, because these things drag on for years. Now, there's the chilling effect, because misgendering somebody is probably contrary. It's probably hate speech under human rights legislation. It probably would not be criminal hate speech. Therefore, a judge is not likely to take away your firearms and your freedom and your liberty because you might misgender somebody in future. However, you can see the chilling effect on speech, right?
Right.
And the whole thing is so wrong on principle, right? That to think that you could end up in jail. Oh yeah, because if you don't comply with these conditions, right? So let's say the judge, you get brought before the judge, and the judge thinks there's a reasonable likelihood that you're going to advocate for genocide in future, and he places you under house arrest and all these different conditions. If you don't accept those conditions, you don't abide by them, and if you say, well, I'm not doing this, then you could go up to jail for a year, possibly 2 years if you have a prior offense for hate speech. You can spend up to 2 years in prison.
Wow.
Oh, and you haven't committed a single crime. You could spend up to 2 years in prison for disagreeing with the judge's restrictions on your liberty, again, based on a reasonable likelihood of you committing a speech crime in future. It is that bad. It is that scary. It's like Minority Report.
That's crazy. Pre-crime is becoming a thing. The other thing you mentioned in this primer you sent me is just how, like, even if these complaints aren't likely to be successful, they will be successful in incurring a cost on you. And I mean, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you may have, I don't know if you had a chance to read a book, came out roughly a decade ago by Ezra Levin, called Shakedown.
Yes.
And so people use the human rights laws to extort money from people, and they'll file a complaint, and you say, oh, you said something racist or homophobic or whatever. And businesses, okay, some business owners, particularly smaller businesses that are owned by individuals, they tend to be very principled and they will fight it. Larger businesses are, well, frankly, they're unprincipled, and they just look at the money often, right? You could argue whether that's right or wrong or ought to be different, but just the reality is they're not necessarily going to go to bat for free expression per se. Larger corporations often, I would say most of the time, don't care about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the free society. They don't care about that stuff. They just want to make money for their shareholders. In any event, a larger corporation, when they're faced with a human rights complaint, their lawyer is going to tell them, you know what, just apologize, write them a $5,000 check. That's the best financial decision for you, because if you fight against this, you're going to be paying me, your lawyer,
Right.
$10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 over the course of the next 2 years to defend yourself.
Right.
So just
when
tell them you're sorry, and just write them a $5,000 check and be done with it.
Yeah. Well, I think Ezra Levant, I remember it was over. He republished the cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad that got a couple of Danish cartoonists killed in the Western Standard. I think he was the only Western publication to reprint that, and he had a human rights complaint lodged against him, and he successfully defended himself, if I recall, but he spent $250,000 doing it. And not everyone is an Ezra Levant who has the fight in them to, like, I mean, I remember watching those recordings of him going to bat against this human. One of the lines that stands out for me is she asked him, what was your intent when you published this thing? And he said, my intent was whatever you find the most offensive intent imaginable. That's what the intent I have, because that's my right as a freeborn Canadian or whatever. And I thought, but most people aren't as articulate. Most people don't have the resources. And so what I'm hearing you say is that, I mean, this is another mechanism by which you can crush small businesses as well, right? Because these guys, like you say, they're principled. I think of the small restaurants that fought Leviathan here during COVID, and the expenses they incurred and the lengths they had to go to, while corporations were just going along with the flow and doing whatever was was going to incur the minimal cost to them.
And in some cases getting favored. Like if you owned the government might shut down your small paint shop, but Walmart would sell paint.
Of course.
Or the government is going to shut down your jewelry shop, but you can buy jewelry at Walmart. And it doesn't even make sense, even if these lockdowns were successful in stopping the spread, which obviously they were not. But if you want people to not meet together, it actually would make more sense to keep all the stores open. So even though maybe most people would go to Walmart, you'd still have other people that are going into the small jewelry store. Like, it's so stupid even to shut them down, even if it was all true. The lies that this virus was as bad as the Spanish flu of 1918, which it wasn't. The lie that it's a threat to everybody, which it wasn't. It was only a threat to certain demographics. The lie that lockdowns were effective in stopping the spread, when obviously they were not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even if it was all true, it was so, I'm sorry, I'm way off topic.
No, this is great.
You get these, we're going to shut down your small, your paint shop, your jewelry shop, we're going to shut down all these small businesses and have more people going to Walmart and Superstore and have more people mixing and mingling together. It was so wicked, and it's really horrific. We have not yet seen the full brunt of the catastrophic mental health, physical health, the tsunami of cancer that's going to come from all these misdiagnoses. We're still going to see a lot more harms coming out of. And by the way, this Friday, March the 15th, marks the 4th anniversary of the violation of our charter rights and freedoms through lockdowns. That was March the 15th, give or take a day, depending on which province. That's when they closed the schools and really started the 2 weeks to flatten the curve.
Yeah, man. And we're still reeling from
not only that, but just a small, again, I'm sorry, it's not free speech, but people who say that this is all over in the past, I'm sorry, there are thousands of doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers, healthcare administrators, who are not allowed to go back to work because they did not get injected with COVID vaccine 2.5 years ago. Yeah. And in Ontario, hospitals will not hire trained, competent, qualified professional nurses because 2.5 years ago, they didn't get injected with COVID shot. Today, in March of 2024, there are qualified nurses in Ontario, and the hospitals will not allow them to work there. And yet we got both the Ontario and BC governments are screaming publicly about how they're suffering understaffing. It's like, You're complaining publicly about not having enough staff, and here you've got people that are ready, willing, and able to go to work tomorrow, and you refuse to hire them back because 2.5 years ago they didn't get this injection.
Right. Well,
so it's not
they're
over. It's right now. These people
Yeah.
are unemployed because they chose not to get this COVID vaccine 2.5 years ago.
Yeah. It's utterly
Vindictive,
insane.
vengeful,
It's
ideological, and zero science.
That's right. And you know, we're still seeing, like, when I go into a hospital as a paramedic, I still have to put a mask on. You know, they brought back a mask mandate for healthcare workers. The patients know we don't need to put them on if you're coming, but somehow they figured there was health care workers spreading COVID around the hospital, so you got to put a mask on. Well, maybe if you told healthcare workers that masks don't work, and so stay home if you got the sniffles.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing actually, a person I know told me today, a nurse who works in a healthcare setting told me today that, she has COVID right now, and she's pretty sure she got it from one of her coworkers who came to work sick, but she was wearing a mask, so she felt like she was fine, right? Because the message we've been getting all this time is that masks work. Well, if masks work, I should be able to come to work sick wearing a mask, but it's like trying to catch mosquitoes with a barbed wire fence. I mean, that the virus goes right through it, and we know this from multiple studies now, that it barely makes a dent in the viral load, and it'll stop droplets, but we know this is an airborne virus. So, but the message that we're sending with these mandates is still dumb, and it's ridiculous. Is there any aspect of this online, I want to call it the Online Causing Harms Act, that could intersect with speech on pushing back against the COVID bureaucracy?
Well, here's the scary part. Okay. And by the way, the process is the punishment when it comes to the human rights thing, right? The punishment at the end of the day, you might be ordered to pay $5,000 to somebody whose feelings were hurt, not $20,000, and it might be $0 payable to the federal government. But it is so it's a hard thing to go through. Now, your question ties in with another terrible aspect of it, which is the online safety, the Digital Safety Commission. Good grief. Isn't it great that we're getting another government body? Like, we don't have enough.
Feeling safer already.
Are you feeling safer already? Now they're gonna enforce the regulations passed by cabinet. So if the Online Harms Act passes in its current form, the federal cabinet is going to get powers to create regulations, which will not be debated in Parliament or voted on in Parliament. The public will find out about them when they are issued and proclaimed into force. So it's kind of like you wake up one morning and the federal government has proclaimed into force a regulation. So we're going to have the Prime Minister Trudeau and the Justice Minister, and the cabinet is going to be responsible for crafting regulations to further define what is harmful or not harmful. And that those regulations will have to be abided by the operators of social media services. A social media service is defined in the Online Harms Act as a platform for interprovincial or international dialogue and facilitating content, posting content, which is even a problem for some citizens advocacy groups. If you were, maybe a Trans-Canada libertarian group chat, and you're talking about, all the fun things libertarians, like to talk about, and, we should all have a right to nuclear missiles in our basement, yes or no, and whatever, right? And you could have a libertarian chat group that could be and you're posting content that could be subject to that could be a social media service that has to comply with federal regulations. And so the Digital Safety Commission, which is the new government body that would be created, they're going to have their staff. Their staff can investigate and prosecute and punish for violating regulations. So separate and apart from the Human Rights Commission,
Right.
Which that threatens every Canadian. Like if I wrote something on the Justice Center website, or if I wrote something on my own, personal website, that could result in a human rights complaint against me.
But
So
can't this also inform the way these big social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter show up in our country as well? Like when they have
exactly the point. That's exactly the point. In the same way that during lockdowns, the government got every restaurant owner, every movie theater ticket taker, every hostess person at the gym, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They all enforced the government's laws, right? Because if you didn't enforce it, you would be subject to big fines. So we got these draconian fines. I'd have to, the number escapes me, but it could be 500,000, $1 million. I don't know, but don't quote me on that. I have to look back on it. There are fines imposed on operators. So if you are running a social media service that falls under the act, if you allow harmful content, then you could get in trouble. So instantly, the government now has an army of well, you can't call them volunteers, but like they're not government employees. They're private people earning a living.
They're corporate employees that are now having to enforce government.
They're going to have to enforce the government dictates on removing any harmful
and I mean, we've
content.
already seen dramatic changes. Well, at least Facebook looks a lot different for me now, ever since the requirement to pay media companies profits from social media, right? And so I can no longer share news content on Facebook. And the theory, I guess, is that Facebook is somehow profiting from these media sites that have their content up for free on their website, and you'd think they'd want to get it out there. And in fact, I've seen the Globe and Mail advertising articles, paying to put their articles up on Facebook now, which is kind of funny. But that totally changed the social media landscape and my ability to get news from sources I like to get it from. Now we're going to see like that bumped up times 100 with this digital safety committee, basically telling social media companies how they have to police speech on their platform. And it's very chilling.
It's chilling. And again, the people who are supporting this now because they think that, this is their opportunity to crack down on homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic, whatever, conservative, libertarian speech, social conservative speech, etc. 20, 30 years from now, there's going to be a different federal cabinet, and they might draft different rules, and they might define harm differently. And, they might say that advocacy for the notion that there are more than two genders and that you can safely and successfully and happily transition to the opposite sex, the advocacy for that is deemed to be harmful. And now, all of a sudden it's going to be a whole other group of people that are going to have to look over their shoulder and make sure that they're not getting prosecuted. So I say that the key issue is, do you want to retain your ability and your right and your dignity as an adult to decide for yourself what is true or false, harmful, not harmful, good, evil, etc.? Do you want to retain your own power and ability to make your own decisions, or do you want to hand that over to a government body which will decide on your behalf what is true or false, what is right or wrong, what is good or evil, what is harmful, what is beneficial?
Well, John, I'd be scared to ask that question to the average Canadian who might say, I'd prefer the government chew my meals for me. I don't know what to make of this. What's your response been? I see you've got an online petition here. Again, guys, the link will be down in the show notes. Obviously, folks that follow your work are strongly going to be opposed to this, but do you see any support for this at all from Canadians?
You mean support for the bill, or support for defeating it? Well, I think that as with most legislation, right, you're going to have some people paying attention and noticing and being for it or against it. You probably have 70, 80, 90% of the population won't know about it, won't hear about it, won't be involved in it. But it
they'll
is
see the title
possible.
and say, "Oh yeah, I'm for
Who's
online safety or
and
less
protecting the
harm."
children, protecting the children from bullying. I mean,
Yeah.
good grief, could you not, is there a way to tug at more heartstrings all at once, right? This is protecting kids from bullying. Well, we've got 26,000 signatures already against the Online Harms Act. And I am going to be in Ottawa in April, and I'm planning to deliver these to the Prime Minister's office. So we're going to taking the petitions online, and then we're going to print them out into hard copy and call a news conference, press conference, and drop them off at the Prime Minister's office. Great. And obviously he's not going to come out and say hello, and we don't expect him to, but they will take those the petitions in that manner. And people should contact their MP. And people who say that political activism doesn't work, look, why does Alberta now have Premier Daniel Smith and not Premier Jason Kenney?
Right.
For one reason only. There's a lot of people that previously had never been that active in politics that rolled up their sleeves and they got engaged in the democratic process. And here you've got a change from one premier to another. Because of grassroots political activism, because Absolutely. Of citizens assuming they're. So, phone your MP or at least email your MP, regardless of what party. I anticipate the Conservative MPs will vote against this, but they still need to hear from their constituents to know that it's important.
Yeah.
But for listeners, if you've got a Liberal or NDP MP, phone them, email them. They do pay attention. If you're a Liberal MP and you suddenly get a small tidal wave of opposition to the Online Harms Act, you're going to sit up and take notice, and you're going to go talk to Trudeau about it, or you might fight within the Liberal Party caucus to water down some of the worst provisions and make the Online Harms Act less harmful.
Right. Is your sense that the NDP and Bloc are supporting this bill?
The bloc has not yet. The latest I heard, and this was a week ago, and it may have changed, that they were going to look at it and decide later on what their position is. I know that in the past, that party's track record is not really strong as a pro-freedom party, but I don't know. I'm not in the business of making predictions. Right. And the NDP, they love this, cracking down on hate. Because that's part of their mindset. They don't seem to understand that you can be a loving person and care deeply about an issue, and you happen to have very different ideas about how the best way to solve it.
Right.
They don't grasp that too well.
Well, and I mean it's just, again, it's typical government kind of double standard or hypocrisy, right? I mean, they're basically doing the very same thing they're trying to outlaw, but doing it to like 10 times worse. It's like, we're inciting violence against people. We're saying, we will take your money. We will take you to jail. We will, we'll use the guns of government if we have to. If you, and we're saying this to you right now in the form of this act. Well, that's an incitement to violence. I mean, this in theory should be illegal under the very act that they're proclaiming here, and yet, of course, we know it isn't. I mean, the government is allowed to do things to you and I that we aren't allowed to do to each other. So, John, what's the best way folks can get involved? So you've talked about writing MP. Is there anywhere where folks can get kind of a talking points bulletin or something that they can copy and paste to send to their MP?
Well, our website, we've got lots of information on the Online Harms Act at www.jccf.ca. So that's Justice Center Constitutional Freedoms, JCCF, F as in freedoms, jccf.ca. And yeah, people should contact their MP. People should sign the petition, and by all means, forward information, share it with your friends, neighbors, family, what have you, that the Online Harms Act is the most serious, most aggressive assault on free speech in modern Canadian history.
Absolutely. And guys, I'll put those links down below so you don't have to remember them. Again, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the notification bell, and make sure you go to my Substack and sign up for newsletters, because this is the kind of thing that's going to be going out on my Substack. If you found this episode important, please go to my Substack. I send out, I don't inundate you with the emails, but when I do, they are important, and this one's important, and it's definitely going to be going out on my Substack. John, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. And I mean, I wish you had good news, but I guess business is booming for you.
Well, things might get worse before they get better, but
Yeah.
I'm confident in the long run that truth will always vanquish the lie, and freedom will win out over tyranny. Justice will win out over injustice. We just have to cultivate the virtues of courage and perseverance, and just keep on fighting, and we're going to win in the end.
Amen. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.